Elliot Mintz, a sound portrait. Elliot Mintz.
This last chapter of the Elliot Mintz sound portrait is not a farewell. We hope that we have been an usher in the cinema of ElliotMintz.com and its content. Within, we hope you may find entertainment and perhaps learn along the way. The inexhaustible supply of memories and subjects shared by Elliot Mintz draw us back to this man for another glass on another evening of pleasant reflection. Hans Lippershey, being the likely inventor of the telescope, was looking for something beyond what everyone else was looking for. In this last chapter, we turn the polished lens of his perspective upon the man himself. Again, Elliot Mintz invites us in.
I am in your hands, Paul, one more time.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
I just poured myself my first glass of the evening, and it's a 2012 Macon Village Chardonnay.
Well, I am also drinking a Chardonnay. The last time we had a conversation of this depth, I was drinking red and you were drinking white. And now we are both drinking white wine.
Would you like to propose a toast over the telephone? And after you propose the toast, we'll click our glasses against the receiver.
Okay, I will. May the airwaves never cease to carry your work. May the calm voice never fail. And may the whole world be privileged to mince words.
Bless you.
That made a lovely sound. So, ladies and gentlemen, the man I'm talking to is Elliot Mintz. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Paul.
Who does Elliot Mintz say that Elliot Mintz is?
Who does Elliot Mintz say that Elliot Mintz is?
The first time we talked, I asked you, who is Elliot Mintz? And you said, depends on who you ask.
That, yeah.
I've got you now.
It's check, but not quite mate. Because there are others, of course, in all of our lives who have visions of who we are, what we represent to them, what we mean, etc. And then there are those of us who are quite assured of who we are. I'm not. I can't answer the question because I don't know who I am. I am working on that on a daily basis. I'm a creature that changes by the hour, minute, second. I can kind of subjectively discuss things that interest Elliot Mintz, that Elliot Mintz is about. I can do all of that. But the actual essence of me is still elusive. I think it was Sir Winston Churchill, who once said that the history of all countries should be written as a citizen of a different country. So the perspective would be from an observational point of view and frequently more accurate. The biography tends to be more accurate than the autobiography. So I therefore would have to return to my initial answer that I gave to you, that it depends on who you ask. I don't know, but I am not completely in touch with Elliot Mintz as an individual.
There are two people that would say that they would have called you, when they were around, they would have called you son. Everyone on earth has that in common. We all come from a mother and a father. So, who were your mother and father, and what are your strongest recollections of them?
The first of the two that come to my mind is my father, because I was closest to him. A very, 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 very good man. An immigrant from Eastern Europe who arrived on the shores when he was 16 years old, with just the shirt on his back and no particular skills. A vision and a dream, escaping the madness of what Europe was like in that time, who began to work in what was called in New York the schmata business. Please don't ask me to spell it. But schmata is kind of a Yiddish word that refers to clothing or fabrics. And he spent 30 or 40 years of his life as a cutter, cutting from patterns what would eventually become women's coats, larger women's coats. And he eventually had a small company with his brother called A&M Fashions. Berman District was 5 or 6 blocks away from Times Square in Manhattan. It was a very difficult life. It was before air conditioning. And summers in that place where my father worked, with those machines, we would cut through 20, 30 different layers or levels of fabric, cotton, things like that, post-war things. I only visited him once or twice when I was a little boy. He took me downtown so I could see where he worked. And it was grimy and dirty. There were 2 or 3 employees, a bookkeeper. He would walk with those push carts through the sidewalks of Manhattan in the heat of summer, delivering his goods to people who might purchase them for retail. He did that most of his life. Towards the end of his life, he dabbled a little in real estate, buying small pieces of property with the money that he saved all of his life. He married my mother after they had a chance meeting at a place called Grossinger's, which was in upstate New York. It was kind of like the getaway place from New York where usually Jewish couples would go to listen to any young men and to dance, to socialize. They would call it being in the mountains. And one day he met my mother there, who, at that time, was a bookkeeper in a small restaurant / nightclub, which she left one day telling her friends that she was going to go to Grossinger's because she wanted to find a husband. And as the story is told to me by my sister, the 2 of them found themselves in the same large room of what would look like a kind of country club. And there was a Sadie Hawkins dance that came on. And my mother, somewhat uncharacteristically, but I wouldn't question my sister's reportage, walked up to my father, who was at the end of the bar with a couple of his pals, and asked if he wanted to dance. And he said yes. And after a very, very brief courtship, he asked for her hand in marriage. And it was less than a year later that I appeared on the scene in 1945. My mother was a homemaker and enjoyed that role, raising my sister and I. We grew up in a lower middle-class neighborhood in the upper part of Manhattan. My father would wake up every morning at 6 or 6:30, board the subway, go down to the Schmata district, work until 7 o'clock in the evening, come back on the subway. He would be grimy and dirty, exhausted. He would take a shower. My mother would have food prepared on the table for the 4 of us to sit and have a simple meal in a 2-bedroom apartment that they lived in all of their lives. Both of them passed away in that apartment. It was the one that I left when I was 17 or 18. They were loving people, demonstrably loving people. They held hands frequently. They talked with each other constantly and loved to laugh. I was the firstborn. They had no roadmap as to what to do. My mother read Dr. Spock's book and listened to advice from my granny. She did her very best with me, and she did better with my sister. And she loved my father dearly. I remember my sister told me that when my mother died of a massive, unexpected heart attack in that apartment, and the emergency crew arrived as they were taking my mother away on a stretcher. She was pronounced dead in the apartment. My father asked the EMT guys to stop for a second, and he got down on his knees, and he touched her hand, and he said, "Thank you."
My,
Those were the kind of people my parents were.
that very touching and both sad and amazing image to think of.
More than 50 years together, and during that period of time, I think they spent 2 days apart, or 3 days apart. It was a different time, Paul. You know, it was what we call the real deal time. And I am certain that there are relationships. I'm just pouring myself one more glass. Hang on a second. And I am certain that there are married couples today who have that kind of romantic camaraderie, but I don't run into a lot of them in the city that I call my home.
Our special guest tonight is Elliot Mintz. On your website, which for anyone listening, they can visit this website. It's completely free, ElliotMintz.com. On that website, interview, the first thing, it's kind of like the introductory course, if you will. It's an extensive interview that you do, and you're being interviewed by the famed DJ Jim Ladd. I wanted you to tell everyone, what are your recollections of that night, because you, and I'm assuming that it was all one night, it looked like it was, you covered a lot of ground.
We did 2 interviews. We did one interview, just Jim and I talking, and it was a long 2-3 hour interview. And at the end of the interview, Jim said, look, there's so many other questions I want to ask you, but it was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, you know me, and he had to get home. But he said, we should try and do this again sometime and go into greater depth. I thought that we had pretty much done it. In fact, that first interview with Jim was edited, and I'm debating right now whether or not we should place some of those segments on YouTube, because there are things discussed in that first one that I never got around to in the second. But we finished that interview, and not long after that, I met a young web designer who I'll be talking to you about in a little while, and I showed him what we had taped that night with the 2 cameras. And he said, you know, this is kind of interesting, but basically you just have 2 talking heads going back and forth, his language, and people don't know really who the heck you are, and there are no examples of what you've done. So you might consider doing another conversation with Jim that could be intercut with videos and audio tapes and stuff from your archives and photographs, and to make it a little bit more intriguing than just 2 talking heads. That led to me inviting Jim back to the house a few weeks later, where we sat. It was all done in one evening. I think we taped 6 hours that night. It was a 2.5 bottle shard evening. Because I remember when the crew left at around 3:30 in the morning and I was kind of cleaning up, I noticed the bottles that were directly behind the speaker, which was the platform that the Tiffany lamp was standing on. And it was very long. It was very intense. Jim exercised tremendous patience. He obviously took a nap in the afternoon to prepare himself for that. But I was determined, Paul. I was determined to tell my tale once, completely, so I would not have to revisit those experiences again. And I simply told Jim he should feel free to ask me anything and everything that he ever wanted to ask me. No holds barred. There would never be a no comment on my part. And that's how that, on the website, it's called Mintz on Mintz, a homage in a way to Blonde on Blonde. And I wanted it done. Also, in the old days, when people would sell Hoover vacuum cleaners door to door, in media and in marketing and in sales, they tell the story that when Hoover introduced their stand-up vacuum cleaner, salesmen would show up at the door, they would knock on the door, and they would say to the housewife, was at home in the afternoon. Look, I've got this wonderful machine that will take all the dirt and dust off of your carpeting and floors. And if you let me come in for just a minute, I'll demonstrate the product for you. And obviously, tens of thousands said, sure, come on in. The man would come in. He would toss a little bag of dirt on the carpet, plug in the Hoover, go back and forth for 15, 20 seconds, allow the housewife to do the same. The dirt was gone. And he would say, for $39 or whatever it costs, you can have this marvelous device. Frankly, I don't know how people got dirt out of their carpet before the invention of the vacuum cleaner. Something worthy of research on a very quiet evening. And that was how the Hoover vacuum cleaner became a household product. In media, one of the lessons learned is if you want people to trust the product, you have to get them to trust the salesman who knocked on the door. Imagine today if somebody walked up to your front door, knocked on the door, and said they were, selling a vacuum cleaner. Would you let them inside so they can throw some dirt on you? And, people hang up on telemarketers. They would slam their door. It was in that first moment when the salesman would have to convince the housewife who he was, that she was safe, he had something to deliver, and perhaps it would enhance her life. And he had a 30 or 60-second soundbite, an opportunity to do that. Elliot Mintz in my website is modeled after the Hoover vacuum cleaner to some degree. But before you pay any attention to the 100 hours of content that I present on the website, maybe it's important to know a little something about the guy who did the stuff and put it together and who's giving it to you for free. Maybe you've got to trust me a little, that I'm not going to send you astray. Maybe you have to trust me that halfway through a sign will come up, if you want more, send $8 a month to this post office box address. Maybe if you knew something more about me and how I felt about the world, that you might feel a camaraderie with me and say, I kind of see things very much like that guy. Or I don't, but I find what he says to be intriguing. I'd like to know a little bit more about his world, his experiences, and the voices in people that brought him to the tentative conclusions that he's sharing with me. That's the purpose of Mintz on Mintz.
You were just talking about voices. One of the voices that one might find on ElliotMintz.com is a very hypnotic voice. This man, I asked you who had made the biggest influence, and you said it was him. And this man was Jack Garris. What was Jack Garris like to be around?
Jack Garris was my very first spiritual teacher. He was a remarkable, remarkable man and left behind a series of recordings. He passed maybe 15 or 20 years ago, if memory serves, maybe more recently. He was certainly never a superstar. He wrote one book that had only modest sales. He lived in the valley with his wonderful wife, Jeanette. And he was the one who set me on the path. I would later make arrangements for him to do a radio show every Sunday on the first station I ever worked on, KPFK Radio. He never proselytized. He never sold any faith trip. Best of my knowledge, he had no specific allegiance to any faith group. He was a scholar who studied the world of spiritualism, metaphysics, and religion. Had one of the greatest libraries I ever saw on the subject. It was in his garage, converted his garage into an old library. It was right next to a little barnyard he had. It was a tiny little house in the valley. And he would record his radio shows in the barnyard where there would be geese and goats We had an open door policy. When he was in the library, the door would be open in case any of the goats or geese or other animals wanted to come in. They would occasionally make sounds or connect with you on some level. He taught without teaching. They were comprised of dozens of conversations I would have with him and his wife, Jeanette, usually over a dinner in a place called Reseda, California. He taught me how to question, how to listen. These are spiritual things. He directed me towards certain teachers, books, philosophies, religions, and just asked me to approach it all with an open heart.
Did he ever discuss with you the time that he worked with Cecil B. DeMille?
In passing, he said that during the course of his life, he was briefly a Hollywood screenplay writer. And I said, oh, well, that's intriguing. Did you write any movies that I might have seen? I said, well, I worked with Cecil on the Ten Commandments.
That's such an incredible thing.
It was a throwaway line over an organic dinner before he taught me how to milk a goat. And I kind of looked up the soup and I said, you worked with Cecil B. DeMille and helped write the Ten Commandments for the movies? He said, yeah, but that was a long time ago. And then he went on to another subject.
That's fantastic.
Completely disassociated for what some would consider to be a credit, what I perceived from Jack as being a distraction, a lifetime of metaphysical pursuits. If ever there was somebody who was not part of Hollywood, it was Jack Garris. But we all have to earn a living. He never sold anything. He would have classes at his house informally for people who wanted to learn. His only book was called The Wayless Way. People would listen to him on Sunday mornings. He would just sit in front of a microphone in his garage library, and he would talk extemporaneously. And then he would do 4 or 5 of those programs, bring the tapes to the radio station, and they would be played. Currently, for those who are interested, there's a wonderful radio program called The Roy of Hollywood Show. It is broadcast nightly from midnight to 5 a.m. over KPFK radio in Los Angeles. And that program is streamed along with the other KPFK programs on the internet. So you could listen to Roy of Hollywood, who presents spoken arts. He's not a disc jockey. It's not a talk show with telephones, but he has access to the most marvelous collection of the most intriguing people in the world. Some are with us and some of them have passed, and he frequently plays recordings of Jack Garris. So if any people who visit my website and listen to my conversations with Jack Garris say, oh, this is cool, I want more, I would direct them to the Roy of Hollywood show on KPFK.
There's some information there on your website, ElliotMintz.com. There's some information there about many different topics relating to media, relating to publicity, even stuff on there about paparazzi. Something that would occur to me is that you've had a lot of interactions dealing with the media, going back to your very early days in radio. When you were interviewing people, you no doubt contacted many people who were associated with press agents, publicists, that kind of thing. Having been a media consultant yourself, you may be especially qualified to answer the question of who is the best publicist? Who's the best PR person you've ever known?
Think about that for a moment. I never thought of PR as a particularly noble occupation. And some of the best PR people were people who just took the position that they would do anything to make their clients famous. They would bend rules, they would lie, in some cases pay off journalists, engage in various behavior that was not all that. I mean, there never was a publicist that Mother Teresa would have retained to represent her. It's a service profession, like all public relations work is, to get people to take an interest in a client or a product. So when I think of people who did it well, it's a double-edged sword. It's kind of like thinking about who's the best criminal attorney in the United States. Well, of course, if I was to pick a name, the best criminal attorney would be the criminal attorney who got his client off, even if he knew that the client may have been guilty of what the person was accused of. I guess that makes the person a very good attorney, but not always the best people. I've also known some excellent criminal defense attorneys who have explained to me that whether or not the client was culpable of committing the crime, it was still their role to defend them. I understand that a doctor who receives a wounded or an injured person who has just been in a gunfight with the police and in the process may have killed a law enforcement officer. And he was shot at, and he appears in the emergency room on a gurney or a stretcher. Well, it's the role of that doctor. He took an oath to do everything he could to preserve the life of the assailant. And I get that too. Well, in PR, you don't have to take any kind of oath. And most of the people, and I apologize in advance to my former colleagues, many of whom were very respectable people and real gentlemen and gentle ladies. I may have liked them as people, but I never cared very much for the profession. There were some superb publicists over at Rogers and Cowan. There were publicists from the old days of Hollywood who, they would do anything to make their client look good. Today's spin doctors and media people, in many cases, lack the passion. It's just become too much of, it's so hard to explain these things without getting myself into trouble by citing examples. I can tell you that today, there's a friend of mine named Michael Levine. He's been a publicist, for 30 years, 40 years. He is a very, very honorable man. He has represented dozens and dozens and dozens of people who have won Academy Awards and had their books in the New York Times bestseller list. And he's a person of honor. I'll tell you what makes a great publicist. Just occurred to me. It's the person with the conviction of saying no to a prospective client because they know it's a sham. So if somebody in the heyday of my public relations days and media days, if somebody came to me and said, look, I've come up with this new thing that I want you to promote. I don't believe in it. The thing really doesn't work all that much. It's a piece of exercise equipment. It's a phony diet pill. It's a handgun that can be made out of paper or cardboard so you can get through airport security. It's kind of an electronic cigarette that really may contain some carcinogens. It's all of these things, but look, I really think that you could come up with a plan, and I'll pay you $25,000 a month to promote it. Well, of course, I would say no, and I'd probably turn down more people than I've accepted. And I know some other people in media and PR who would do the same. That would be my definition of a great publicist.
Well, what about the best interviewers? Who does Elliot Mintz say the best interviewers are?
Are or were?
How about both?
Today, Christiane Amanpour, who you see on CNN and occasionally on 60 Minutes, is one of the very, very best interviewers. She's excellent. Her style and her technique is, that's the bar that you have to reach. I think that Charlie Rose does a fabulous job at what he does. Bill Moyers is a man who gave us the extraordinary series of the interviews with Joseph Campbell that's available on YouTube and DVDs and all the ways to get things. I always admired him, and I admired his style tremendously. Those are three names that come to mind immediately. In the old days, and I guess I can refer to the old days as well, I liked Jack Parr because of his natural curiosity. I liked Mike Wallace because he knew how to extract information. He was tough and, certainly wasn't my style. But if you were a bad guy and was foolish enough to sit down with Mike Wallace to try and spin your story about what you were doing in a telemarketing boiler room, Wallace was good at getting to the heart of the matter. David Susskind was one of the pioneers in television. I liked the way Steve Allen had interchanges and exchanges with people. He was very conversational. In a very underrated category, Hugh Hefner, in the probably early 60s, hosted a program, a television show called Playboy After Dark, where he recreated a living room scene and invited jazz musicians and comedians, people like Mort Saul and Bruce, and he would engage them in conversation. I thought he did a really fine job at that. Those are the ones that come to my mind immediately. It's also a dying art, partially because people don't take the time to listen. Larry King was very non-judgmental in his approach in broadcasting, and I liked him very much for that reason. He allowed people to speak, which is why so many people went to see him. One of the criticisms that was lodged against him was that he only asked softball questions. I heard that many times said I didn't know why it was necessary to always ask hardball questions. An interview doesn't have to be a deposition. That was something that Mike Wallace specialized in. Chris Wallace does the same, but I think he's more arrogant. I tend to like conversations more than interviews. By the way, among the 5 things, and there are only 5 that I do well, interviewing was one of my skills. I can say that unabashedly, that when it came to that form of exchange, I was pretty good at it.
On that note, when somebody goes on your website, ElliotMintz.com, you're going to find a couple of fairly recent filmed conversations that you had. You do an interview with a woman who's written a number of books It's on the website. It's a section called Self-Publish Your Book. There's other conversations that you have with different people. Although you've kind of gone on to another chapter in your life, in your heart, are you still an interviewer?
In my heart, I'm still a listener. And sometimes when I'm with friends and I'm really curious about something that they're speaking about, and I bombard them with questions, they sometimes say, Elliot, is this an interview? Do you have a tape recorder running somewhere? There are some things, that just don't leave you. I just find that just pouring myself another glass of Chard. Give me a second, Paul. The third glass for anybody who's keeping count. In the website, there is a section that we call Fireside Chats. The Fireside Chats basically is to allow people to kind of eavesdrop as to what it's like at my house when I invite a friend over to sit and talk. It's more of a conversation than an interview. Although, there's a subtle line between the two. You will find that in my interviews, I rarely, if ever, give an opinion. In a fireside chat, I tip my hand a couple of times. Just walking outside here on the deck now to look at the moon as we're speaking. In the fireside chats, yes, there's a conversation with a woman named Jen Ashton who teaches people how to self-publish their own books. She was very successful publishing stories about erotica. That is her specialty. A single mom raising a child who hit bottom, who I met, who I liked, and who overnight amassed an enormous amount of attention, money, and sales just by self-publishing her stories. The reason for me inviting her to sit by the fireplace was to infuse other people with the knowledge that they have that ability, that we all know something about something. And forget about looking for a literary agent. Forget about trying to convince a New York publishing house to publish your work. Forget about putting up your own money to buy 5,000 books from some organization, some company, and it's up to you to sell them. She teaches you how to self-publish, put the material online, and sell it yourself. And I was hoping that that conversation would open the door for other people, primarily women, single women with a tale to tell, as to how they could do the same. That's why Jen came to the house, and I'm hoping that people will go to the site, listen to her tale, and say, there are things that occurred in my life that I think I could incorporate, as well as people who say, I'm a good photographer. I've taken pictures. Maybe I can self-publish a book about my own pictures, as well as a plumber who might say, I'd like to put together a little booklet, 40 or 50 pages, as to how to fix the things in your house that require plumbing without calling somebody to come to your place for $60 an hour to do it. And I want to sell it on Amazon.com for $4 a piece. And I'm hoping that 10,000 people will click yes. And I'll make $40,000 while I'm sleeping. And I invited Marianne Williamson to discuss the things that she talks about having to do with spiritualism, A Course in Miracles, and her life. I invited Sean Ono Lennon to come by because he's been to my house hundreds of times. I love him. He is brilliant. He is wonderful. He is funny. And I just thought, I don't want to be selfish here. Let's share what a night would be like if Sean Ono Lennon came to your house. And so it is with a number of the fireside chats, including some that have some tragic stories to them. There is a fireside chat that takes place having to do with a subject called Rett syndrome, R-E-T-T, Syndrom, Rett syndrome. It is a combination of the more advanced forms of autism coupled with neuromuscular disorder, where it affects little girls, usually at the age of 3. Where you bring a happy, healthy little baby home from the hospital, who develops all of her skills like any other little child, and a vocabulary and all the rest of it, and something happens. And that within a day or 2 or 3, that happy, healthy little girl loses her entire vocabulary. It's like somebody pushed delete on download, and she can't walk, she can't move, she can't eat. It's Rett syndrome. Well, I went to the home of a marvelous couple, Heidi and Jonathan Epstein, who are raising a little girl, Hannah, who has Rett. More advanced form of, not as advanced a form of Rett as I've just described, but nevertheless, Rett. And I spent a day with them, shooting videotape and trying to get to the essence of this tragedy. It's called A Parent's Worst Nightmare on the website. I did it specifically because I wanted to create public awareness of something that most people have never heard of, and in the process to direct people to an organization called the Rett Syndrome Research Trust, which is working to put an end to this horror. 97% of every dollar raised by them goes directly to science. 2-3 staff members. Playing for change. I interview a man who records homeless or street musicians, takes the music, makes DVDs, sells them, uses the money to build music schools so children can learn how to make their own music. Yes, the fireside chats are chats and conversations with people I would have, whether or not I had a website. Those are the kinds of folks that I have come to visit me, and those are the kinds of discussions that we have, and those are the subjects that are of great importance to me.
Our conversation tonight is with Elliot Mintz. Your website is free for anyone out there that wants to view the website. It's ElliotMintz.com. In an interview not too long ago, Livingston Taylor said, "Money is a poor substitute for the creative process." How does it feel to know that people, and you're seeing this interaction on Facebook and so forth, that people are being able to see the interviews that you did throughout your life? It can be entertainment, it can be education. How does it feel when you know that people, this entire library, it's just, you're opening it up? What do you think about now that it's open?
And by the way, it's only partially open. It's about as much as I could handle during the first go-around. I think we've put up 100 or 150 hours. I've never actually counted it. Couldn't imagine anybody who would. But, Paul, I have to tell you that I have maybe 700 more hours of material that has not been identified, labeled, digitalized, classified. They're just in boxes, unmarked boxes. I moved very fast during my life and recorded things and took the tapes and I never had the time to look back. So it would take years and probably a professional archivist to go through the hundreds of hours of stuff that I still can't find. One of the things that disappointed me was there were a couple of things that I wanted to include on the site when it first went public that I just couldn't find. I knew I had it and I knew I had seen it, and I had gone through a series of boxes where I thought it might be. But I spent a wonderful, wonderful afternoon with Dr. Hunter S. Thompson in the kitchen of Don Johnson and Melanie Griffith's ranch in Malibu, where he just held my little camera and videotaped the conversation with Hunter Thompson and myself. I thought that would be a really nice gift to share with people. Still can't quite find it, and hundreds of others. So the website is an ongoing work in progress. I want to get away from it for a while. I want to see, how many people react to what they're seeing, if it's enhancing their lives in some kind of way, if it's meaningful to them. If it is, I'll come back with the web designer, and we'll go through the process of restoring these tapes, digitalizing them, removing commercials, removing phone numbers, removing stuff that doesn't work, trying to hold the tapes together because they're stretched or damaged by the heat. It sometimes can take 10, 15 hours to create a 15 or a 20-minute interview ready for the web. And right now I'd like to spend a little bit of time going horseback riding and taking my eyes off of the screen. But if there is a calling for it, if people's lives are being enhanced by it in some minor way, I'll come back to it. I'll give them more. I like the idea of giving it away. Frankly, I think that if I had charged them for this, it would be a disservice to the whole concept.
During the first interview we had, you told us your favorite Beatles song and your favorite John Lennon song. What song of any artist, if you had to pick one, is the one that means the most to you? And let me qualify that. I mean, truly, any melody. It could be an American songbook standard. It could be a classical piece, pop song, jazz tune. The song that resonates the strongest in your heart.
As time goes by.
Why is that?
That's the one that just bounced into my brain when you asked the question. And upon reflection, for all the right reasons. It would be like you asking me about my favorite song, or possibly my favorite movie. Casablanca. I mean, I'm an old softy when it comes to the movies, like movies about romance. And I love romantic songs, and I love all the American song classics. I was so pleased when Linda Ronstadt liberated those songs from the closet. Prior to Linda doing her collection of those marvelous 1940s songs, they had been kept in the Dust Bowl somewhere. She let them out. Others started to do the same. Rod Stewart did a wonderful series as well of these classic, gorgeous songs by Rodgers and Hammerstein and Sonny Kahn and Irving Berlin and Rodgers and Hart and what we call the Tin Pan Alley songs. They come to my mind immediately. Of course, there are rock songs that were anthems to my generation, which I love and play all the time. I was in the car yesterday and took the top and cranked up the greatest hits of Jackson Browne and listened to him sing The Pretender and Linda Paloma and those. Listening to Frank Sinatra doing Only the Lonely in the late night hours is extraordinary. Do you know the first live recording that was ever done, Paul? The first album that was done outside of the studio where they took the microphones and brought them someplace else?
Which one was that?
Judy Garland at Carnegie Hall. Have you ever heard that album?
I have indeed. I didn't know that was the first.
That was the first time. To my knowledge, we'll be corrected, of course, if I got this one wrong. But I believe that was the case. And by the way, it's much better to listen to it on disc, on vinyl, than CD. It was a really poor transfer. A great deal of the audience reaction was truncated to make space on the disc. But on vinyl, that puts you in Carnegie Hall when Judy Garland did that exquisite concert. Well, there are times when I just have to hear Over the Rainbow and go to the vinyl and go to the last 15 minutes of that concert. And she touches me tremendously, as well as her signature songs. There are dozens of them. Music plays an incredibly important part of my life. I couldn't imagine my life without music. that business about if you had to surrender one of your five senses, which would it be? Always problematic. But the one that would remain number 5 would be the ability to hear. Because to be deprived of the sound of music, that's like living without food or water. I have music playing almost all the time, wherever I am, unless I'm in meditation, even if it's just in the background. I like the melodies of life. I like where music takes me. Songs are mini biographies. They tell the tales of the person who wrote them. In some cases, the people who sing them. In the best cases, a little bit of both. And also, in the music department, I love jazz and I love classical music, and play as much of those two genres as I do the standards or the rock songs. I like Japanese shakuhachi music. I like music from foreign lands. I like Middle Eastern music. The only kind of music that I've not been able to totally embrace, as I know I should, is opera. I would love to develop a greater clarity and connection to opera. It hasn't happened yet. Summer's not over.
If there was a theme song, keeping with the theme here of music, if there was a song that best describes you, it could have lyrics or it could be an instrumental, what would be the song that would best describe you?
It's a great question. Why didn't I ever ask that question when I was doing this stuff? Give me a second. Song that would best describe me. I don't know. I mean, the two obvious knee-jerk responses would be Imagine by John and Chimes of Freedom by Bob, because of all the obvious reasons. But they would describe a part of me, the wish aspirations of me, the hidden, not the hidden, but the spoken longings. But the song about me, which I think goes to the heart of your question, I don't know if I've heard it yet. Maybe I should write it.
Maybe. Elliot, again, it's been a very, very fascinating conversation. I've enjoyed it so much, but I always end the same way. I always end very open. For anyone who's listening, wherever they are and whenever they hear this, what do you want to say to them?
Well, two things. One, I want to make an addendum to an earlier question you asked when I was indicating some of my favorite interviewers. I'd like to insert your name in that pastiche. Because, as I mentioned to you during our first encounter, I think that you are superb at what you do and encourage you to do more. I think you are a marvelous interviewer. So that's the addendum.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Paul. And as far as the other, this is the first interview that I've done now that the website is complete and available on mobile devices and all the stuff. And I intend to do a few more, but I wanted to do this one with you because when we first spoke, you got it. I think you really got the essence of who I was in terms of broadcasting, in terms of being a media consultant. I listened to the radio show that you put together. I thought it was really comprehensive and, intelligent and sophisticated and classy, more so than I deserved. So I invite people to sample the site. And again, this is free. I don't put $1 in my pocket, and I am not selling any kind of trip. I'm not telling anybody what to believe or not believe. It's just a gift. I was fortunate enough to meet and talk with, and in some cases become friends with some really extraordinary people. To me, it's just an honor to share the gift with others, and I hope that some people will be touched by it. And that's the reason that I invite you to visit the website. I'd be very interested in your comments, your thoughts, your impressions. And beyond that, nobody is more anxious or interested or curious as to where the next step on the yellow brick road will take me. So now that the website is, for the most part, complete, my slate is clean again, the blackboard does not have any scratches upon it, and we will see what Destiny's hand places on the agenda for what's to come.
Elliot, first of all, thank you very much again for giving us this interview, and I only hope that the next interview isn't as many years away as the last one was. Farewell.
You have my phone number, and you are always welcome to call, Paul. You're one of the people I will speak with anytime you have any curiosity about anything that I might be involved in.
Farewell is a beautiful and soft word, and yet it is a horrible and a heavy thing too. So we won't say farewell. We will say so long.
So long, Paul.